When Africans immigrate, many do not forget where they come from. We do not forget the family or friends we left behind, and the numbers prove this. In 2019, Africans abroad sent $47 billion back to the continent. This is a figure that far exceeds how much foreign direct investment and official development money comes into the continent. These are only the recorded flows. The true size, including those that come through informal channels, is even expected to be larger. Remittances to sub-Saharan Africa unfortunately declined in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but recovered in 2021. However, with inflation soaring across the world and the cost of living rising, remittances from African nationals working abroad appear to be taking another hit. In Kenya, remittances have fallen from $3.9 million in March this year to $3.18 million in September. This is according to Kenya's central bank. And in Ghana, the picture is similar. In December 2021, Ghanaians living abroad sent $4.1 billion to their relatives at home. But by July this year, that figure had declined to $1.9 billion. Ali Khan Satchu, Geo-Economic Analyst, joins me right now to discuss the factors that could be behind this trend and what we need to take notice of. Ali Khan, it's good to see you again. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good to see you.
So this is a numbers game, which means we can follow the trends. But let's also look at a trend that many people were expecting that didn't come to be. So during COVID-19, the expectation was that remittance was actually going to fall, and it proved to be quite resilient. I think except for Nigeria, which actually recorded a loss, remittances on the continent largely increased for many people, and analysts seem to have missed this. They expected that there would be a decrease. So what do you think analysts missed that we should take cognizance of as we have this conversation?
Well, I think, you mentioned it in your opening. You were talking about formal and informal channels. And I think we've got a situation where more, which was coming through informal channels, is coming through formal channels as it becomes easier to use those channels. So I think we've got this underpinning where we're overall undercounting total remittances, but within that nuance, the nuance in that is that more and more money is coming through the formal channel. So I think that's what analysts missed in that analysis. And I would think that overall, if you took both channels together, the number actually decreased in 2019.
So we can look at this in terms of the absolute amounts going to different countries and then also looking at it compared to the GDP. So let me give you some figures now. For 2019, South Sudan, remittances to South Sudan were 35% of the GDP. In Lesotho, they were 21% of the GDP. In Gambia, 15%. In absolute terms, Nigeria alone received about half of the total remittance flows to sub-Saharan Africa in 2019. So it's not just a conversation about quote-unquote poor countries. So when you look at the importance that remittances have, why are they such a vital lifeline to millions across the continent?
So of course, there's significant differences between different countries, but the importance of remittances, which overtook FDI a few years ago, is important not only to the countries receiving those remittances, particularly in relation to the currency, but also important for millions of households across the continent. And that analysis shows that until now, the majority of inward remittances are being spent on family upkeep and family support. Obviously, banks are excited by the prospect of moving more of that money into productive investments. But overall, this is a lifeline for millions of households across the continent.
So we spoke about a trend earlier, so let's look at another trend that we might need to take notice of, and that's the numbers coming in for Kenya and Ghana, which are two of the countries that also take large amounts of remittances. In recent times, we've seen that there's been a decline in these key countries. Do you think this is just what's happening now, just a specific to these countries, or should we be looking at this as part of a wider trend in the coming months?
I think this is part of a wider trend. I think if you look into the source economies of these remittances, the USA, advanced economies, and also the Middle East, what you can see particularly in Europe and America is a massive surge in living costs, which means those individuals have less disposable income. And I think that's going to crimp inward remittances onto the continent going forward. And I think the Ghana numbers and Kenya numbers are signaling that. So overall, I do expect this time around a very noticeable dip in inward remittances onto the continent. For now, the Middle East and oil-producing countries are outperforming others, and therefore that geographical area, I think, will continue to see increases in outward remittances back into the continent. But yes, the cost of living crisis is severe. People's incomes have been reduced dramatically. You just have to look at energy bills in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and you can't expect remittances to hold up in the face of that kind of pressure.
And it's a good thing you mentioned that, because that's the expectation, that as people in Europe and the US try to stay warm, the money they're able to send home will actually reduce. But what would be the impact of that? Let's look at Kenya for an example now. We see that many African countries count on the remittances that come in as an injection of foreign currency. It also helps the economies as well to improve the states of many of the countries' balance of payments. It's not something that's factored into the GDP, but we often hear it as a percentage of the GDP. So what impact do we expect if these remittances are to fall in the coming months?
So I think this is another pressure point. You know, we've got a perfect storm of pressure building up in Africa at the moment. You've got the debt problem, which we're seeing in an extreme scenario unfold in somewhere like Ghana, where the currency is in free fall, notwithstanding those enormous remittances that come into Ghana. So we've got other pressures building up, and I think this is a further pressure point on all our economies, and also will have a factor to play in the currency scenario with a very strong dollar. If inward remittances start to reduce dramatically, it's going to mean African currencies will come under further pressure than they're already experiencing. And it will also mean that people who've relied on inward remittances from family members are going to have to tighten their belts, unfortunately, because I just don't see, this cost of living crisis in the Western world is very dramatic. Real incomes have dropped more than 10% over the last 24 months. That means disposable money has been reduced dramatically.
And when we talk about remittances, we have to also, of course, talk about the cost of sending this money, because as you mentioned, banks and money transfer institutions, they're making a lot of money from being in the business. It's said to be that it's cost about 8% of the money that an African outside is sending home to send that money home. But when you look at it, it's easier for you to send money to London and Shanghai than it is for you to send into places like Nigeria and Kenya. If we're able to handle this transfer situation, would we see a larger amount of remittances? Because it also makes it difficult for us to get into the informal, those people who will hand an envelope over to somebody who's traveling to give it to a family member. What do we do about the actual cost of sending this money home?
You're absolutely right. The cost of remitting money into Africa is egregious and usurious. It's highly unfortunate. I think, it's very difficult to legislate an improvement in those rates. You just got to increase the amount of competition, and then you will see dramatic reductions. I mean, examples of places where it's very cheap is somewhere like Somalia, ironically, where rates are in the region of 2% or less. So there's no reason for these very, very high rates to transfer money. And I think we've just got to see increased competition. More and more banks are getting interested because of these spreads of around 8%. And I think over time, we're going to see quite a sharp reduction in the costs associated with remittances. But it is outrageous.
And finally, Ali Khan, we hear the World Bank continue to sound the alarm about the potential of a global recession in 2023, a possible string of financial crisis in emerging markets as well as developing economies as well. So when you look at the microeconomic headwinds that are happening across the continent and across the world as well, what do you think we should expect when it comes to the trend for remittances into the end of 2022 and the first quarter of next year?
I still think, notwithstanding quite a gloomy report out of the World Bank and the IMF, that economists generally don't understand the scale of the macro headwinds which are now unfolding. And unfortunately, emerging markets and frontier markets are caught like rabbits in the headlights. I take you back to Ghana again, where the currency is now the worst performing currency in the world this year. It's dropped over 50%. And this is a symptom of the disease. So I think, we got some serious challenges. I think, the World Bank and the IMF remain bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about it still. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be policymakers in our countries and their response capabilities. We watched the Truss Kwarteng show in Great Britain unfold, and it really was a catastrophe. But this is a symptom which is not just unique to the United Kingdom; it's across the world, that a lot of policymakers simply don't understand the situation that they find themselves in. There's a great plus if your policymaker understands it. I take Hichilema in Zambia as a good example. Whether by luck or design, he's essentially ahead of the curve. It's time a lot of our other leaders got ahead of the curve as well. Remittances are going to be caught in the crossfire. I estimate down 10 to 15% year on year.
Wow, 10 to 15%. All right, it's something that many of us need to buckle up for. Alikan Satchu, thank you as always for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And you would have seen what it costs for remittances to come in, but also the benefits to the economies. You also have someone like the United Nations saying that remittances to the African continent provide a critical lifeline to millions of families on the continent, and also help for the continent to improve towards the actualization of the SDGs. Remittances are not just money that family sends abroad. It's much more than that, and our policymakers need to take note of that.